some people introduce you by saying, and here's somebody who needs no introduction. I find that isn't true these days. I was walking through Waterloo Station not very long ago, and a man came up to me and said, "Here," he said, "here, didn't you used to be Paddy Ashdown?" So the fact that you've invited me here today seems to indicate that I still am, and that's jolly reassuring for me, if not necessarily for anybody else. And I want to thank some people in this room for, first of all, inviting me along to this extraordinary and very important event. And I'm privileged indeed to be, in a sense, sort of opening it. There are some in this room without which this book, which frankly, if I'd have known what a huge task it was, I would not have undertaken, but without whom it simply would have been impossible to write. One of them sitting at the front here, Sylvie Young, who came to help me quite out of the blue and has been absolutely instrumental in helping me to put this together in all sorts of ways that I explain in the acknowledgements of the book, but who is now fully engaged with the publishers who are going to publish the book to my delight in France, Gallimard, Pierre Nora, who actually was in the Vercors as a young boy at the time, has bought the book, was going to publish the book. And then others in this room as well, David Harrison, who has been a tremendous help and support to me, not only with this book, but with my previous one, in helping me through some of the intricacies of SOE files. And perhaps especially, since he is here, a man who is himself probably the doyen of resistance historians in Britain, who nevertheless has given extraordinary, unselfishly and generously of his time and advice in getting things right, which otherwise I would have got hopelessly wrong, which is Rod Kedward, who's sitting in the middle up here. And I go a great debt to them, and that's the reason why I'm here today. I'm a little bit nervous, to be honest, because this is my first outing with this book. It seems to be a day of technical problems. One of the technical problems isn't just that your film hasn't arrived, but also my book hasn't arrived either. Indeed, we fixed this day on the basis that the publishers, Collins, said they would be available, the first ones. I'm so sorry they're not. They will be available next week. They're available on Amazon now. It's going to be formally published on the 5th of June at Hatchard's. It's going to be launched in Piccadilly. And anybody who does want to buy a copy, I'm very happy to sign, as Chris said earlier on, the plates, which you can stick in there afterwards. So, let's go. And I wrote the book. I was very struck by the fact that there are some really fabulous characters, extraordinary characters, in this history, in this story. But one of them is the character of the great plateau of the Vercors itself. And so I thought I'd start by introducing the plateau of the Vercors, for those who don't know it, as I describe it in the book. So this is what I say. For those who live around the Vercors Massif, from the ancient city of Grenoble, lying close beneath its northeastern point, to the vineyards of Valence scattered around its southwestern slopes, the forbidding cliffs of the plateau are the ramparts of another country. Even when hidden behind a curtain of summer rain, or with its summits covered by the swirling clouds of a winter tempest, this great plateau is still there, offering something different from the drudgery and oppression of ordinary life down below. Best of all, in deep winter days, up there on the Vercors, looking down on the sea of cloud, all is brilliant sunshine, deep blue skies, virgin snow, and a horizon crowded with the shimmering peaks of the Alps. Today, this is a place of summer escape and winter exhilaration, but its older reputation was as a place of hard living and of refuge from retribution and oppression. The historical importance of the Vercors lies in its strategic position, dominating two major transport corridors of this part of France. The Route Napoleon, which broadly speaking is that, which passes almost in the shadow of the plateau's eastern wall, and the valley of the River Rhône, which flows through Valence some 15 kilometers away from its southwestern shoulder. The Romans came this way 50 years before the birth of Christ. 8 centuries later, the Saracens occupied Grenoble for nearly a decade. 100 years later, towards the end of the 10th century, the Vikings came too, but from the opposite direction, south down the Rhône in their longships. And 400 years after that, the Burgundian armies followed them on their own campaign of conquest and pillage. And then, of course, in March 1815, Napoleon marched his growing army north past the Vercors to Grenoble, Paris, and his nemesis at Waterloo. The plateau itself is shaped like a huge north-pointing arrowhead, some 50 kilometers wide, long and 20 wide. It covers in all 400,000 hectares, about the same size as the Isle of Wight. An Englishman who will play a small part in our history described it in his prosaic Anglo-Saxon way as a great aircraft carrier steaming north from the middle of France towards the English Channel. Many factors and many personalities shaped the events which took place on the Vercors during the Second World War, but one of them was the extraordinary, secluded, rugged, almost mythical nature of the plateau itself. And so it was, ladies and gentlemen, that when France fell and was divided in two with the Germans, the Vercors fell in the southern liberated zone. The plateau soon began to be seen once again as a place of refuge. And three groups of local people operating entirely independently started to plot and plan about its future use when the moment of liberation came. Two men, Jean Prévost and Pierre Dalloz, both writers, both intellectuals, met one day in early spring 1941 to cut down a walnut tree and discuss the possibility of using the plateau as a fortress when liberation came. A group of socialist plotters met in a cafe behind Grenoble station a few weeks later and linked up with another left-wing group in Villard-de-Lans up on the plateau on Easter Monday 1941. Their plan was to use the plateau as the seedbed from which a new, more socialist and republican France would emerge. And then on the 11th of November 1942, when the Germans invaded the southern free zone and took over all of France and coincidentally disbanded the French Armistice Army, they forced many of the officers and men of the old French Armistice Army to take to the maquis in the forests of the plateau. And they were joined in late 1943 and in early 1944, they were joined in late 1943 by a great flood of young Frenchmen who were called the réfractaires, who fled the plateau to avoid being used as compulsory labor to Germany. You historians here will have spotted the mistake there. It's late 1942 and early 1943. They were housed initially in mountain cabins and out-of-the-way farms, such as this one, the Ferme d'Ambel, which was established in the early weeks of 1943. It was, some say, the first organized maquis in France. Let me point out to you that these young men fled to the maquis for a complex set of reasons, not all of them to do with patriotism. For some, it was simply a matter of avoiding being sent to Germany. For others, it was seen as a form of civil disobedience. For many, it was the romance of living the clandestine life in the mountains and the forests. Down there, on the plain, men and women lived lives which were inevitably tainted by the daily exigency of coexistence with the enemy. But up there, on the high places in the forests, the air was clean and freedom was pure and uncompromised. But whatever their motives, all now lived and had to rely, all now lived the clandestine life, all now lived as outlaws who had to rely on the already established resistance movements for their food, their shelter, and their protection. And so it was that by the early months of 1943, the forests and fastnesses of places like the Vercors had become home and refuge to a polyglot collection of the broken elements of defeated France, its new generations, its old administrators, its competing political parties, its heterodox communities, and the scattered fragments of its once proud army. Soon it was realized that the young men had to be prepared for what everyone knew would come in due course. Teams of ex-soldiers were set up to provide military training in the Vercors camps. The curriculum, by the way, included instruction in military skills, maneuver, weapon handling, physical exercises, map reading, camp discipline, hygiene, and political studies. In the evenings, there were boisterous games and singing of patriotic songs around the campfire. A small booklet was even produced on how to be a resistance fighter. There was also some less conventional training given by one of the Vercor's most unusual and remarkable characters. Fabien Rey was famous on the plateau before the war as a poacher, a frequenter of the shadowy spaces beyond the law, an initiate into the mysteries of the Vercor's forests and hidden caves, and an intimate of the secret lives of all its creatures. During the summer and autumn months of 1943, when not striding from camp to camp, his latest crop of trapped foxes swinging from his belt, he could always be found sitting in his cabin, invigilating a bubbling stew of strange delicacies, such as the intestines of wild boars and the feathered heads of eagles, which he would press on every visitor who passed. He too wrote a small cycler-styled handbook on how to live off the land on the plateau, and it too was eagerly read by the young men, by the refractaires. By now, the whole of the Vercor's community was involved in one way or another in supporting and hiding, feeding, sustaining the resistance camps scattered across the plateau. One of them was Mémé Borda. Mémé Borda kept a bar, cafe, and restaurant for the refreshment of travellers crossing the Col de Rousset at the southern end of the plateau. One day, hot on the trail of a group of young maquisards, came a troop of Italian alpini, led by an officer who demanded to know where the Maquis were. Mémé Borda denied any knowledge of the Maquis. Indeed, she wanted to know exactly what were these mythical creatures, the Maquis, for she had never seen them. The Italian officer replied that they were the young men who lived in the mountains. Again, Mémé Borda professed absolute ignorance. Once again, the Italian returned to the charge, demanding in more insistent terms to know where the fugitives were. Finally, the good Mémé Borda lifted her skirt, pulled down her knickers, and pointing to her bosom, told the officer that if he really wished to know where the young men were, no doubt he could find them up there. The officer, being an Italian, left red-faced, taking his alpini with him. Here is, I'm not sure this is going to work, but we'll try it anyway. Here is, yeah, I didn't think it would. What a pity. Yes, it will. Here is a short film. I just want to show you what this looked like. This was shot by a resistance film team who visited the plateau in the early months of 1944, and it gives you some view, some sense of what the area was like and what the young men now looked like in the summer of 1943 and of 1944. This may be a little bit later. That was an American who passed by, and it looked to me as though he was one of those that dropped in to finally train the Maquis. But here they are living in the mountain refuges. Probably, my guess is this is during the early summer of 1944. British Bren gun, of course. So, by the autumn of 1943, a rough guerrilla army were emerging. What they didn't have was arms. But that began to change on the night of the 11th of November 1943, when the Vercors received its first parachute drop of arms from 3 Halifax bombers on the Darbanus plateau, the Darbanus pasture, high on the western edge of the plateau. And here is an eyewitness description, which I quote in the book, of what happened that night. By midnight, all was ready, and there was nothing to do but wait. The moon slowly slipped behind the horizon, threatening to leave us all alone under a silent and empty sky. And then suddenly, borne on the wind, there was a sound like a far-off whispering. Almost nothing, no more than the rustle of leaves make in a breeze. But quickly it became more constant, heavier somehow, and with a kind of strong underlying beat. Soon we could tell where it came from. The northwest, it was them. It was undoubtedly them. Our commander pulled out a large electric torch, and pointing it in the direction of the noise, he started to flash a series of dots and dashes in Morse code. Suddenly, there, up there, a new star appeared and flashed back the same sequence at us. They had seen us. Light the fires! Immediately, a lance of flame, fanned almost flat by the wind, leapt out of the darkness nearby. And then another, and another, and another, until a vast letter T was picked out in flames. Above us, we heard the still invisible aircraft, turning as though enclosing us in a wide circle of noise, holding us in an embrace of friendship. And then the miracle happened. One of the aircraft burst out of the darkness above us, following the line of the long stroke of the T, and suddenly, beneath it, a great white flower blossomed against the darkness of the sky, as though it was the product of magic, conjured into existence by the black shape above us. Then there was another, and another, and another. The spectacle was one of utterly intoxicating, utterly astonishing beauty. Now we could see the round circles of the parachutes jostling each other for position. Below each one swung a long, black, cylindrical shape. At first we thought they were men. And then a dull, heavy thud, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, 6, 10, 20, 30, repeated and repeated and repeated. The white flowers now lay deflated, exhausted, dead and lifeless on the ground around us. The miraculous cargo had arrived. In the end, however, the arms, the explosive, the equipment, though all were magnificent, our nocturnal visitors brought us an even more special gift. They got us back our confidence, our enthusiasm, and with these the sure knowledge that we were not, after all, isolated, abandoned, and alone. What came next was winter. And the winter of 1943-44 was very tough indeed. Many indeed couldn't take it in the isolated cabins up on the plateau, surrounded by swirling snow, and left to return to the plains. But when the spring came, more young men came up to the plateau. During the first half of 1944, France prepared for the great event that everyone knew was coming that year, D-Day and the long-awaited invasion. There were now some 2,500 maquisards in organized units on the Vercors, and another 1,000 or so in the villages around the plateau, waiting for the call to rise and join them. At 10:30, on the night of the 5th of June, the French service of the BBC sent out 187 code messages. They were all different. Il y a de l'eau dans le gaz. Les carottes sont cuites. Méfie-toi du toreador. But they all meant the same thing. Your liberation is at hand. D-Day is at dawn tomorrow. Rise and fight. Here's one witness statement from a young man who heard the message that night. For René Piron, in the town of Romont, just below the western wall of the Vercors plateau, the night of D-Day was not a quiet one. It was midnight, he wrote. A violent banging on my door made me wake up with a start. I had no weapons in the house, so I thought of what had happened to our chief Michel, who had suddenly been arrested by the Germans and his driver the previous Sunday. I was scared stiff, but I had no choice. I opened the door and let out a sigh of relief. It was our Lieutenant Jeannot, dressed in hiking clothes and standing, ironically, to attention. He told me, still half asleep, that the Allies would be landing at dawn this morning on the beaches of Normandy, and that as planned, the sabotage of the railway system in the Romont area had to be executed immediately. He had to repeat the message to me twice before I got it, and it took my breath away. We knew exactly what we had to do. Now we would have to come out into the open. Now we would have to become terrorists. I threw on my maquisard clothes and started mentally to check how many men we had and how many would now not be able to come with us. At 5 o'clock, my sack on my back, I said goodbye to my wife and left home. She was very brave and uttered no syllable of complaint. I can see their faces now, my comrades, on that morning of the 6th of June, standing together in the darkness on the terrace in front of my house, waiting for the truck. I can see them still as they took their weapons out from the hiding places, assembled them and cleaned them for action, for all the world as if we were experienced soldiers. I can see their faces, serious and determined, no bravado, just the cold resolution a man feels when he must leave behind all that he loves, all that he lives for. His wife, his children, and his possessions, all to be reduced to no more than a dear memory held in the heart. And so it was all over France, as Allied landing craft were using the final hours of darkness to maneuver into position for their dawn run into the Normandy beaches. French men, and some women, were slipping through the darkness down silent streets to knock on neighbors' doors and tell them that the hour had come. Worried wives were saying goodbye to husbands they might never see again. And young men, and some not so young, were pulling on boots and hitching up rucksacks before quietly closing their front doors behind them and vanishing into the darkness. Of course, the Germans knew what was happening, and orders were sent out to the 157th Reserve Division based in Grenoble under the command of Lieutenant General Karl Flang to destroy the Maquis concentrations as soon as possible. The Germans launched their first attack to gain a foothold on the plateau at Saint-Nizier, above Grenoble, on the 13th of June. In all, they made 3 attempts at assault on Saint-Nizier, succeeding only on their final attack in driving out all the French defenders who were forced to fall back onto the southern half of the plateau, protected on all sides by gorges and cliffs. That's what the southern half looks like about then. Over the next 6 weeks, the Allies tried to reinforce the plateau, including with secret agents and troops, but never with sufficient strength to be able to defend against a further German assault. Here are some of the people who played a part in that. This, of course, is the famous Francis Cammaerts, arguably the most successful British SOE agent, certainly in the south of France, maybe in the whole of France. He more or less controlled the whole of the southeast of France single-handedly. Aged 28, 29, he nevertheless was widely respected by all the Maquisard commanders throughout his area. Next to him is Henry Thackthwaite, an ex-schoolteacher, parachuted in with the Union mission at the end of 1943 to assess the strengths on the Vercors. Along with him in the Union mission was this man, Peter Ortiz, US Marine Corps, a larger-than-life character in all senses. He went on to appear in John Wayne films after the war, actually, and he can still be seen as an extra in some of those. These two are rather strange SOE characters, John Houseman and Dennis Long. They were leaders of the Eucalyptus mission. Quite why they were sent there, I don't know. I think Cammaerts certainly thought they would come as tourists in somebody else's war. One of them couldn't even speak French, and neither of them had a particular knowledge of what was going on. There's quite a sense of controversy about when they finally left. And there was an inquiry afterwards as to whether they had behaved appropriately. You can draw your own conclusions when you read my book. This woman I'm deeply in love with, I have to say. She is the great Christine Granville, Christina Scarbeck, Countess Christina Scarbeck, MI6 agent before the war, smuggled British troops over the Tetra Mountains in the middle of snow when others perished in the cold. Unbelievably, fabulously beautiful, fabulously courageous, fabulously promiscuous. Just my kind of girl, really. My wife isn't here, so I can say that. She was parachuted in out of a moonlit sky to help as Francis Cammaerts' courier. They became lovers on the first night that they met, whilst being strafed not by one but by 2 Messerschmitt 109s. Which shows a certain dedication to the task that most of us would find utterly admirable. Maybe I'm not allowed to say that here. Explanation, so they were an extraordinary collection of people. So was this man. His name is Jean Tournissart. He was the Frenchman who was parachuted in, ordered by Jacques Soustel, to set up a landing site at the village of Vassieux so that Dakotas could be flown in with paratroops and heavy arms. There were no heavy arms. And his task was, in the period of the last couple of weeks, to build an airstrip that the Allies could use. The Americans also parachuted in 15 commandos. This is Mission Justine. Their job was to train the Maquisards and to help to mount ambushes and aggressive operations around the edges of the plateau. And they did a couple of 3 quite remarkable operations I described in the book. On the 3rd of July, a ceremony was held in Saint-Martin-en-Vercors, which announced the establishment of the Free Republic of the Vercors. It was, all those at the ceremony believed, to be the birthplace of the new Fourth Republic. And some even said, not without reason, the first home in France of General de Gaulle himself, who would fly in and announce the establishment of the Fourth Republic, from which the liberated France would grow. 10 days later, on the 14th of July, Bastille Day, 76 American flying fortresses dropped 95 tons of arms and ammunition to the plateau in the largest daylight drop of the French resistance, to the French resistance of the Second World War. But this time, the Germans were waiting. As soon as the Americans left, they launched an air attack on the village of Vassieux. It was the start of a week of intensive German attacks on the plateau as the prelude, as everybody understood, to a formidable German assault on the plateau itself. Everyone knew that it was the precursor of a major attack. And what is heartbreaking in this book is the messages that were sent over the last week, 10 days, desperate messages saying, reinforce us with the parachutists you've promised us, send us heavy weapons, we're going to have to sustain a major attack on the plateau. Jean Tournissart frantically built his strip by night. He couldn't by day because it was under German air attack. And the Vercors leaders sent out increasingly urgent appeals for the troop reinforcements that they had been clearly promised and the heavy weapons they needed, but they never came. On the 21st of July, the day arrived when all those heady dreams ended. And here's what I say in the book. On the morning of the 21st of July, Jean Tournissart mopped his brow and packed up his theodolite. It had been a good night's work. Another 24 hours or so and the airstrip would finally be completed. There was even talk of a grand parade to be attended by all the Vercors dignitaries to mark the end of their labours and the opening of the little airfield. Tournissart looked towards the rim of the mountains marking the eastern ramparts of the Vercors and watched for a few moments as they became etched in darker relief against the red glow of an angry dawn. At least the rain had stopped. Looking at his watch, he noted it was a little before 5 o'clock in the morning. In an hour or so, it would be fully light and the German fighters would be back. Sure enough, and right on time, a few moments after 5 o'clock, the first German spotter plane of the day came skimming over a low ridge and let loose several bursts of machine gun fire, sending most of Tournissart's men scurrying back to the cover of Vassieux. Among those running back to the relative safety of their quarters in a barn close to Vassieux Mairie was Casimir Seibenecken, one of the Polish students in Villars who had been conscripted to work on the site. He remembered, our work on the strip was nearly finished and our bosses told us soon we would be able to play our part in defeating the enemy with arms rather than shovels. As dawn turned to morning, Vassieux settled down to another day of German bombing and strafing. In the barns, shelters and houses of the village, the night workers made themselves as comfortable as they could and hoped for a good day's sleep. Someone commented that the German fighters were later than usual that day. Then, at shortly before 9 o'clock, they heard the low rumble of approaching aircraft to the south. Not the high-pitched whine of fighters, something very different. A few rushed out onto the streets to see a line of distant black dots emerging from the cloud base and descending towards them. They were coming from the same direction as the American bombers which had dropped all those arms on the 14th of July. Someone shouted, "Les Amerlots, les Amerlots," the Americans. But marking units in the Drôme forest south of the Vercors knew that these were not the Americans. 20 minutes earlier, at 0900, they had seen a large number of Dornier bombers lumbering over, their noses tilting awkwardly skyward to counter the drag of the glider, each towed behind them. They sent a message to Algiers, but it wasn't decoded till 2 days later. Luftwaffe Lieutenant Friedrich Schäfer had assembled his men beside their assault gliders on the tarmac at Lyon airport as a misty dawn broke that morning. His final orders were brief and brutal. One of his men was later to describe them: hit hard and fast, don't wait to find out who's who. He who hesitates is lost. They would be outnumbered, he explained, so they must shoot on sight, and without any discriminating between civilians and combatants. The only way to win was speed, shock, total ruthlessness. Jerzy Dellinger was in the middle of peeling potatoes for lunch when he heard the noise of the approaching armada, and he knew it for what it was. It was the sound, he remembered it, as the sound of Dornier bombers flying over his parents' house in Lyon. "It's not the Americans," he shouted, "it's the Germans." Soon, black crosses on glinting wings became visible, sending many scurrying for cover, and those who had them for their weapons. But some just watched, stunned and mesmerized, as at a height of 2,500 meters and 10 kilometers out from their targets, the first 9 gliders detached from their parent aircraft and headed straight for Vassieux. At a height of 300 meters, small circular khaki-colored brake parachutes flowered from their tails, and then, very close to the ground now, they leveled out, fired retro rockets from their noses like snorting fiery dragons, and landed with astonishing precision in just a handful of meters. Even before the gliders had bumped to a halt, their occupants were out firing and running for the nearest shelter, while their pilots gave them covering fire from the machine guns mounted on the glider roofs. By now, the defenders, stunned surprise, had turned to furious action. French machine guns opened up, and 2 gliders were hit, crashing and killing their pilots and 7 of Schaeffer's men, including the unit medical officer. But the Germans had the momentum and heavy air support. Now the air was full of Focke-Wulf 190 fighter bombers roaring overhead, providing close support to Schaeffer's furious assault. In a storm of grenades and automatic fire, the Germans soon had full command of the village. It was the start of a simultaneous 4-pronged German assault from the north, from the south, from the eastern passes, over the eastern passes, and of course from the air. The fighting was furious and went on for 3 days, but with upwards of 12,000 fully armed German troops and armour against what was now 4,500 lightly armed Maquisards. The result was, of course, inevitable. What followed was massacre and destruction, and atrocities not seen before on the Western Front, imported indeed from the Eastern Front. More than 200 civilians were killed and 600 Maquisards, some with terrible sadism. So, a terrible defeat? Well, that's the way it's always been written, but I don't agree. Actually, I think this wasn't a defeat. For finally the Maquisards dispersed into the forests, where the Germans dared not follow them for fear of ambush. There followed 3 weeks of terrible privation, with little food and even less water. But the main body of the French fighting forces, sometimes through astonishing leadership by their commanders, survived intact. The Germans' aims were to destroy the Maquis forces, capture their leaders, render the plateau useless for further resistance. They achieved not one of them. On the 15th of August, 6 weeks after the Vercors had been ordered to rise, the Allies finally landed on the Mediterranean coast and began sweeping north along the Rhone Valley. Now the Maquisards emerged from the forest, their weapons in their hands, and drove the enemy from the plateau, linking up with the Allies and helping to liberate Grenoble. In my view, they had turned a terrible defeat into a victory, albeit a cruel and bitter one. Of villains in this story, there are many. But who are the heroes? Well, here's how I end my book. What of the Maquisards themselves? I'm frankly astonished at the raw courage of the vast majority of these young, inexperienced, often inadequately led, underarmed, and massively outnumbered fighters. When all was lost, it was their stalwart endurance during the days of refuge and privation in the forests which denied the Germans the success they most sought, the destruction of resistance on the plateau. In the end, it was they who enabled the French to return to the offensive in a way which turned what seemed an unavoidable defeat into a final, if bitter, victory. If there are heroes in this story, they can be found among these extraordinary men, some of whom had lived a hunted life for 2 hard years, winter and summer on the plateau, while others went to war, still in the clothes they left home in, only days previously. Not all of them were brave, not all of them died well, not all of them acted as they should have done. How could we expect otherwise, given their motley backgrounds and how unready they were for the terrible trials which they faced? But those who understand the terrors of war will find it extraordinary that so many of these men were ready when the moment came to stand up and take on face to face the gathered might of the world's finest army in what they genuinely believed was the noble cause of the liberation of their country. Thank you very much. We've gone on a little longer than I thought, but I suppose that'll do. So I'm ready to answer any questions. Can't tell you how much I enjoyed writing this book. It took me 4 years altogether. In truth, as I say in the beginning, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. It was a far, far bigger topic than I'd ever imagined. And the individual story, the individual voice of the Maquisards that I tried to bring out from some of those extracts I must have read upwards of 60 or 65 books in French, gathering together all that witness evidence. I hope gives the voice of the ordinary maquisard, but I've also tried in the book, and I haven't managed to touch it in that presentation, to try and set it within its political context. De Gaulle, what he was trying to achieve, the battle between Churchill and Roosevelt about where the southern invasion would take place, the original, how did the Vercors fit into Churchill's plan about a southern invasion that if it couldn't go through the Balkans would come across the Italian passes. So all of that politics is in there, but it's the voice of these young men. I wanted to make sure was heard within that context. And there are sort of two reasons for that. The first is that I'm just amazed by the fact that they literally were called to the plateau, some of them, days. Some of them took on the German army, never having fired a weapon before, never having handled one 24 hours before they went to war, and many in the white shirts. I dedicate the book to the young man in the white shirt, many of them still wearing the clothes and the white shirts that they actually came up in a moment of captivating patriotism, in my view. They actually believed what most soldiers don't believe, that they were going to war for their country. Most soldiers go to war for their mate who's next to them, although politicians like to believe otherwise. And I wanted to make sure that their voice was heard. So there we are. Anybody want to ask any questions?
Got a microphone here.
I think we're okay, actually. I'll try and repeat the questions if they can't be heard.
Thanks for that, Paddy. Very interesting. In places I was thinking of sort of Mount Kenya and the Mau Mau with the forests and the high terrain. In places I was thinking of the whole of the wall and the cowboy films. But something that was interesting to me was, and you briefly alluded to it, was what was going on before D-Day in 42, 43, where presumably you had this plateau which was sort of outdoor haven. You mentioned briefly that the mountain troops from Italy were sort of poking around the edges. What was actually going on before things really kicked off? And did the Germans and the Axis forces just leave it concentrated as they knew where it was, but it was too much trouble to go?
No, the Italians were doing their best in a sort of Italian kind of way to get rid of the maquisards, the refractaires camps. They knew that this was a threat, and they knew it would grow during 1943. But the problem in 1943 was to really decapitate the resistance structures, Jean Moulin, de l'Estrin. They had not yet formed into forces that could provide a danger if there was a military danger behind the front lines in the case of an invasion. But the key moment when everything changed in the Vercors was when the Italians signed the armistice and the Germans took over the entire, because this was in the Italian area during the after the end of the German invasion of the 11th of November 1942. But then the Germans took over, and then it became much more serious, the attempts to get rid of the maquisards. First of all, the Germans, as they did a bit in the Glières Plateau, and the sadness of this is the exact replica, an exact repetition of the disasters that had occurred in Glières, in Montmouchet, and later on in the Barcelonnette siege as well. They've tried to use the milices, and there's an event where the milices come in, they occupy Vassieux, they hold a series of trials, they shoot 3 or 4, but eventually the Germans decided the milices weren't going to be serious enough to do this, so they had to do it themselves. So it's the build-up of all of this. From the start, unthreatening young men, avoiding the conscription, slowly being turned into a rough guerrilla force, reinforced by the army when the disbandment of the armistice army takes place, military training, improving their military capability, then being taken over pretty well, lock, stock and barrel in the early months of 1944 by the French army, so it becomes a French army operation, which is, I think, one of the reasons why they made the mistake of trying to defend it on fixed lines rather than vanishing into the forests. And then on the other side, not much attention being paid to the Italians rather inefficiently trying to get rid of the maquisard camps, the Germans coming in and finally using the milices, and then finally a full-scale German invasion using a reinforced division under Flamme. What's interesting about this, and I'm afraid I do use the word, though I don't blame him for it, is that in the end, the reason why the Vercors was abandoned, and I use the word abandoned, was because de Gaulle in Algiers had an alternative plan. De Gaulle, remember, was trying to restore the greatness of France. And he was not content with playing a minor part in supporting the D-Day invasion, and then a larger but still minor part under a British general in the southern invasion. He wanted his own invasion, an airborne invasion on the Massif Central. It was called Operation Cayman. And right the way through the key weeks of July, de Gaulle was negotiating with the Allies on this frankly ridiculous plan that the Allies should have said was ridiculous from the start. They certainly thought it was ridiculous, but for political reasons weren't prepared to be frank to de Gaulle. And this plan, and therefore all the French units, including a French parachute unit that could have been dropped into the Vercors to support the Vercors, were held in abeyance for Operation Cayman. Now, I can understand why de Gaulle wanted Operation Cayman. If you were de Gaulle trying to play a part in your own country's liberation, trying to make sure that you become the government of France and not the socialists and communists, that you can restore the greatness of France, to have a northern invasion led by the Americans, a southern invasion led by the British, and a central invasion, an air invasion on the Massif Central, key strategic position in France, led by the French, you were really making a political point that would help in what he was trying to achieve. But in the end, those units that could have been sent in to reinforce the Vercors at the last moment were actually held in abeyance. And it was only literally on the 22nd of July, that is the day after the Germans began their invasion, that the Allies finally said they were not going to go along with Cayman, and that those forces got released too late. My view, and I stated, sorry it's a long answer to the question, but my view, and I said, is that I think the Allies were intending to land on the 23rd. That was the first day of the new moon period. And I think the Germans got there on the 21st in a break in the weather, because they were very well aware of the fact that if they didn't, the Allies were coming into John Turnissau's strip 2 nights later. And literally it was a race to who got there first, and the Germans did, with the consequences we talked about. Sorry, long answer, but... Sir?
Hello. Eugene Howell. You've answered part of my question already. But the first phase of the question is, would it be fair to say that the Vercors rising was really half-cock? Went off half-cock because it doesn't really help. Did it help in any way the Normandy landings? Obviously, it would be quite useful if it was timed and sort of liaison with the Frejus landings. And then a broader question, as a military man, you might care to answer. It's also the anniversary of the NBFU. This notion of trying to hold a castle by air.
Very interesting. But I was talking about this on the way up with Martin. Let me answer the first of those. The original Allied plan was to have a northern and a southern invasion simultaneous. We were going to launch on Normandy, we were going to attack in the south. The attack was, the southern attack, the southern invasion was always seen as a diversionary invasion. That it was not the main event, but it was designed to keep the German forces in the south as a diversion. I think, Sylvie, you better correct me if the dates are here or wrong, but in about January 44, Eisenhower decided that they didn't have enough landing craft to be able to do 2 simultaneous invasions. The Vercors was always seen as rising in support of the simultaneous invasion of North and South. But then they got delayed by about 6 or 8 weeks, and people forgot to say to the Vercors, don't bother to rise. I mean, the undertakings given by Eugène Chavon, the civil leader of the Vercors when he visited Algiers, and indeed inferentially and specifically before, was that the Vercors would not be asked to hold out for more than 3 weeks. In fact, it held out for 6. So the separation of the 2 landings was one of the mistakes that was made. The second point is that, and there's a very crucial moment, the day is, I think, the 3rd of June, that is 3 days before. Eisenhower is asked, the original plan was for the resistance to be brought to action in 2 stages. In the north, close to the Normandy landings, coincidental with the Normandy landings. In the south, they would not be called to action until, in the context, of course, Vercors in the south, until in the context of the southern invasion. Eisenhower is asked on the 3rd of June, do you want to stick to the original plan and get the North to rise only? And Eisenhower said, no, I want them all to rise. Because, I mean, tout le monde à la bataille, in the famous words of Foch. because we need to keep the Germans believing that there may be a southern invasion. And Henry Thackthwaite, who was the SOE agent, was the person who specifically persuaded Eisenhower that if you do not raise the south with the north, the Germans will conclude that the southern invasion, which they greatly fear, was going to be coming at the same time, will happen. And Eisenhower took a decision which a commander has to take. He knew it was going to be touch and go, crossing the beaches of Normandy. In many ways, this is the hidden story of Normandy. You know what happened on Normandy. You know where almost every soldier was. You do not know the part the French played in that. And the part was to make, and Eisenhower was very clear, that they would be sacrificed because they would rise early, the Germans would respond, and he could not support and help them. But nevertheless, to get himself across the beaches in Normandy and to be able to do the breakout, he needed to keep the Germans guessing. And that's why those signals were sent out on the 5th of June to 187, to every resistance unit across France, to rise at the same time. And the Vercors was one, but certainly maybe the biggest one, but certainly not the only one of the sacrifices made in the end to Eisenhower's perfectly reasonable military decision. I believe that if de Gaulle had been told Cayman was not in operation, that it was not a viable proposition, then there were certain forces that could have been used to reinforce the Vercors, which probably would have made it more difficult for the Germans eventually to win, but not necessarily stop them doing so. The second big mistake that was made, the second really big mistake that was made was that they decided that they would defend this with fixed defensive positions, which is a pretty idiotic military decision. It is doubly idiotic when the concept of the redoubt, the reduit, had already been proved a failure in Glières, in the Montmouchet, and in Barcelonnette after D-Day. So this was the fourth attempt at the redoubt strategy, using fixed lines to defend against a German determination to take over. The fourth attempt, which really shouldn't have happened in the face of the failures of the first three. Yes?
Very interesting to hear you referring to Glières and to Barcelonnette. And I wondered, in the build-up to writing the book, how much you were relying on oral testimonies and whether that changed your view in terms of the argument in your book. And subsequently, given what's going on in the revisionist of Glières, how long do you think it would take for that Maquis to be reviewed in the way that we're now witnessing the Maquis of Glières?
I didn't answer the Dien Bien Phu question. And I'll come back to this. What is fascinating is that of all of the people who played a key part in this, Alain Leray, Roland Costa de Burga, Descours himself, I think, Zeller as well, all of them became generals of one sort or another who saw active service in Vietnam. And I have a sort of lingering worry that the concept of the fixed redoubt, which they tried to exercise in the Vercors, was still the dominant feature of some of their thinking when they came to Dien Bien Phu. Look, the answer is I've used a huge amount of testimony. Some we have obtained, not a lot because there aren't many survivors, from those who were there at the time, who are still alive, and a huge amount from the myriad of books, J'étais un maquisard dans le Vercors, and put them together. So in terms of telling the Vercors story, a lot of testimony. No is the answer to Glières and Barcelonnette. I haven't. I've been looking at the... it plays a part, and I described the Glières, but I've done it very much from Jean-Louis Crémieux de Briac's book and other books as well. So the Glières is interesting to me only from the fact that it was the first outing of the redoubt theory, and failed for all those reasons. I can't tell you when that will be revisited, so I really can't. It's an important part of the build-up that explains the Vercors in its context, but I don't go into the Glières or Barcelonnette, for that matter, in more detail than that. Does that answer your question?
Well, it doesn't really address the question, which is to what extent the oral testimonies have written a slightly different narrative.
You mean in respect to the Vercors?
Yes.
Well, look, of course I have. I mean, you know, the oral testimonies, witness testimonies, are the eye of the person who saw them. I remember when I wrote my own diaries, I said that diaries were the most seductive form of historical inaccuracy, because in fact they give one person's view, and you know, historical accuracy giving lots of people's view. The bit that I quoted about the Darbanou's parachute comes from Vallot, André Vallot, who writes in a wonderfully flowery fashion, as you'd imagine, so indeed is Gilbert Joseph. They are their description of what happened, and almost certainly coloured to support the story they want to tell. But you have to make choices, inevitably, where you believe what you're told and where you don't. They're not always right. For instance, Pizzarella, who writes a lot about this, including his own personal experiences, I don't trust some of the stuff that Pizzarella says. In particular, he says that parachutists were used and they weren't, which is a major, you know, for the invasion of Vassieux. So, is the witness testimony perfect history? No. Is it history? Yes, because it's that person's view of what happened. Is it a means of telling the perfectly rounded story? Obviously not. Is it a means of making sure that you give voice to the feelings of the people who are there? Yes. You take it, you know, with those ups and downs, and you make choices about it, don't you? I mean, I do. I had to. And sometimes you may make the wrong one, and maybe I have to. I mean, in particular, Pizzarella's story about the atrocities that were committed in Vassieux. Undoubtedly, there were terrible atrocities committed by the so-called Mongols, the Eastern troops that were brought in from the Eastern Front. Undoubtedly. But undoubtedly also they were, you know, sometimes fabricated and certainly overcoloured. In some cases, the story of cutting people's heads off with bandsaws, etc., of which there are photographs manifestly fakes, is, in my view, you have to reject that, whilst at the same time accepting that some of the things that were done are well documented, well testified to, and are certainly true, and are revolting in their own right. By the way, you can get it from both sides. Christine Cammerz was a great colourer of her own story. I mean, Christine Granville also wildly overcolours her story. It's a story that she tells about how she parachuted into the Vassieux, which is completely unsupported by other evidence of people who were there at the time. So you don't just have to be a member of the Maquisards to overcolour a story, as I know from politics. There are three, the slight digression, but I hope it shows the point. There are three wonderful historical records of the last words of William Pitt the Younger. The government, of which he was the head, said his last words were, "My country, oh my country, how I love my country." Bang, died. The opposition said his last words were, "My country, oh my country, how I leave my country." In other words, they'll have a mess. Died. The third version is, "I could really go another of Mr. Bellamy's pork pies." Which of these three do you think is correct? I know what I think is correct. Anybody else? Not.
The thing about the role of the Vichy forces, by the working with the Germans during this operation?
Yes, I mean, in two ways, I suppose. The Millys, of course, the Millys raid on La Chapelle and Vassieux, the Millys trials. And there's a wonderful Millys spy, Maud Champetier de Ribes, who is another fabled creature. Yes, they were certainly there. They certainly played a part. And I think it was a rather ineffective part. Quite interestingly, during the Millys occupation of Vassieux, there was a little German group of people living in the Hotel Bellier in La Chapelle. No one knows quite what they were there for, but I think they were there to see what kind of job the Millys did. And as in the Glière, they sent the Millys in first, who were then driven back, and only then did the Germans come in. I think the Germans concluded they couldn't rely on the Millys as a military force that would resolve their problem for them, and they would have to use a proper German force to do that. The Millys, of course, supported that, and certainly in the final invasion played a role in that, certainly played a role in some of the executions that went on of the young Maquisards who were caught. So I don't think militarily they played a very big role. But there's absolutely no doubt that the intelligence systems that were set up, which used the Millys intelligence networks along with the German intelligence, was effective. and some of the spies they sent in, I have a chapter which I discuss the two intelligence network on both sides, how they used them, how they used restaurateurs, how they used, barmaids, how they used the milice to provide information for both sides. The French had a very, very good resistance intelligence service that was able to spot, identify and report on the German troop movements as they started to gather for the attack on the Vercors. So there's the political battle, of course, there's the military battle, but there's also an intelligence battle going on in the background here. And indeed, the Allies' intelligence services are also very much engaged on the Vercors at the time. So the milice, I don't think, were very effective from a military angle, and decreasingly so as you came towards D-Day and after D-Day. But I don't think we should underestimate the support that they gave to German intelligence. The Germans made one very, very big error. They thought that the headquarters of Huet was the commander of the French forces on the Vercors, was in Vassieux. It wasn't, it was in Saint-Martin-en-Vercors. And the result was that Huet got away with his forces pretty well intact and was able to maintain not only his own headquarters, but the integrity of his troop forces in the forests, in what I think is an outstanding piece of leadership over those desperate 3 or 4 weeks after the invasion and before the Allies invaded. Huet's a very simple, straightforward, uncomplicated French soldier driven by honor and patriotism, but I think he's one of the heroes of the story. He understands why what he's been asked to do was wrong. He argues the case against it. When he's told he has to do it by Marcel Descours, he goes ahead and does it to the best extent that he can. From then on, he takes all the right military decisions on what was a doomed strategy. I think he took very fine calculations about what to do when. He knew exactly the moment when the thing was unsustainable, told his men to go off into the forests at just the right time, and then held them together in the forest extraordinarily, in my view. And then brought them out at exactly the right time. He was encouraged by Descours to bring them out early, but he wouldn't do that. The right time he brings them out plays a major part in driving them, the Germans, off the plateau, and in the liberation of... he was heavily criticized, of Grenoble. He was heavily criticized after the war, but in my view, he's one of the heroes of the story. A hero as unlike me as you can possibly get, by the way, very sort of, very unemotional, very calm, very rational man. Deeply honest man, but quite a simple man in a way. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. You mentioned the cafe owner, the woman at the beginning of your piece. I wondered if you'd had a chance to look at the role civilian women played in
Oh, it's such an important point, that. Such an important point. It's a point I would very easily have missed, and had it not been for that man sitting over there, Rod Kedward, who told me you have missed it. By the way, Francis Cametz, I'm an ex-soldier, that's the way I sort of think. I was aware of the extraordinary role played by the community in the Vercors, who, maybe out of naivety, at the start there was no downside, no penalty for supporting the resistance until the Germans came along, and if you were caught, they're going to burn your farm and slaughter your livestock. Then things started to change, and there's quite an interesting moment after the fall of Saint-Nizier when... And indeed after Vassieux, after the milice occupation of Vassieux, when the farmers and the peasants of the Vercors said, hang on, we're perfectly prepared to support you if it didn't cost us anything, but now it's costing us our cattle, and there's a bit of a rift that grows up. But Francis Cametz, after the war, went out of his way to say the role of women in supporting the resistance. Who was it who would carry the key messages? It was the women. Who was it who would sneak out at night and leave a box of pâté and a bag of cheeses in a barn or under a tree? It was the women. One woman actually led a Maquisard unit in the Vercors. They were deeply involved in the early restructuring of the resistance after it was broken up by the Germans in late 1943. What Rod calls the woman at the door, what's your phrase which I use in the book?
Woman at the doorway.
The woman at the doorway is absolutely vital. And in the last chapter, and earlier on, I hope, whether sufficiently is not for you to judge. I guess there'll be many who say I don't pay it. But in the last chapter, I go out of my way to say the role of the women in sustaining the whole of the resistance structures, in sustaining those camps, in helping to provide leadership, and above all in those crucial weeks of privation when people were driven to starvation was really crucial in this process, and it's a thing which is often missed. You have to recognise, as perhaps I didn't when I started this, that the resistance movement, certainly in the Vercors, and I guess elsewhere in France, was absolutely inseparable from the community. It was there to support them, and in many cases, with men absent in the forest and the maquis, that meant the women. Have we done? Sir?
Just taking that one step further, did you find any instances of women combatants?
Yes. Yes, there are. And there's this particular woman, I can't remember her name, who led a maquisard unit, who led an active maquis. She was one of Descours' Lilette. No, Lilette was different. Lilette Sage was, she was a courier, but was also very sort of active with weapons. But there was a woman who led one of the maquisard units, fighting maquisard unit, in the Vercors. Yeah. Sir?
Going back to your answer to the question before last about geographical location and resistance being inseparable, that leads into a question. You've chosen the Vercors as a specific geographical location, and now there are many, you say 187 messages of on the 6th of June, so assuming 187 locations. So the question has to be, why Vercors, why not Glières, why not Montgalbon in the Limousin, why not Brittany?
Because I was fascinated with the Vercors. Because, you know, when I was a young diplomat in Geneva, in the British mission, I visited the Vercors, became fascinated. You know, war and the pity of war. And I'm also fascinated with, when I was in Special Forces, we used to have this phrase, you know, big thumbs on little maps, that's the way to kill the chaps. And I'm fascinated by those things where the people up top who make military decisions who don't understand what that means for the soldier on the ground, and to identify those. My last book was about it, this book's about it too. So I was fascinated by that. And then when I said I want to write this story, my agent, Michael Sisson, said to me, I think you should write it as the story of a maquis, but also trying to show the wider implications. So an example of what the resistance was like. This was a story which illuminates, for instance, the kind of thing that the French did on the ground, the hidden story of D-Day. It's happening elsewhere as well. But your point's a very good one. It'll fall to others. Robert Gilday, I'm told, is thinking about doing it, to write the wider history of the resistance, and there are many other books. That wasn't what I wanted to tell. I wanted to tell the story of the Vercors, okay, and through that reflected, so I hope, some of the wider issues you talk about. So that's what I wanted to do, and that's what I've done. You may decide how successfully. But fascinatingly, what is, I suppose if you said, what are the two testaments that the French would like to look at as the signature events of what happened in the Second World War, one would undoubtedly be Oradour-sur-Glane, and I suppose the second might be the Vercors. I mean, that's why, for instance, every French president has made sure that they refer to the spirit of the Vercors. That's why Mitterrand built this vast museum above Vassieux at considerable public cost. Why Sarkozy went to the Vercors and summoned up the spirit of the Vercors. That's why in every French town and city you will find a Place Vercors, Place du Vercors, or a Rue du Vercors. It has an iconic position, I think, in the French's view, is this a fair thing to say, of themselves during the war, of one of the things that happened that defines the wider resistance. However, there was serious, and there remains today, quite serious criticism that the concentration on the Vercors story has snuffed out or submerged some of these other important stories, which are not fully understood because of the dominance of the Vercors in the way that we've just described. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I answered the question.
Sorry?
Yes, answered.
Thank you. Shall we take Rod?
Quickly add that I think your book's going to be very, very well received in France. I just wondered how the American market.
I haven't a clue.
Because it's very important, I think,
Yeah.
with the Americans, just how much was done by the French. Because there still is this kind of absurd prejudice about the French of having been people who give in too easily.
Yeah, it's certainly Roosevelt's view.
Exactly, and I think this would re-establish some of the kind of points that a lot of people are trying to make for a very long time about the role played by civilians, by ordinary people, in some kind of resistance movement. And as this is the opening to 2 days on the resistance, it's been a wonderful talk and a wonderful book, I think it's going to be. Could you just say how you might...
You're a brave man, Rod. If you want to change the established view of themselves, of the American people, help yourself. And the part they played in the war, and the relative, no, I know you're not, and the relative failure of anybody else to do anything. I don't know how it'll go down in the America. I mean, the truth is the Americans actually did provide troops on the ground, parachutes on the ground, which the French did not, by the way. I mean, you know, when they landed, when the Justine Commando landed, the half operational group landed, the French said, well, now we know we're serious to Eisenhower, even if we're not serious to de Gaulle. So they did play a part in this, and some of the fascinating records are still ones that you can find in the National Archives in America. But I rather doubt that this will have huge sales in America. I hope it does. I hope someone will make a film of it. You know, I can think of all sorts of people who I can suggest as the stars. So I don't even know if it'll sell in America, to be honest. Rod, maybe you know. Well, thank you very much. I hope it sells in Britain. I am delighted and hugely flattered by the fact that Gallimard have decided, you know, as you know, it is not, the French are not very good at publishing any, I mean, you're an exception, a brilliant exception, at publishing any book written by a Briton about something which is French, let alone something as iconic as this. And it was a very, very cheeky thing to do for me, relatively unknown and relatively unknowing, to pop up and try and do it. Pierre Nora, who is in charge of Gallimard, was actually there as a 11-year-old, I think, and his brother was with Jean Prévost in his last days in the Grotte des Fées, which I found, by the way, and went down the Grotte des Fées. It's fabulous. This place that, she's been there too, but she went down separately. And you've got to go down a little bit of a rope and then in, and this is where Jean Prévost spent his last days, along with Pierre Nora's brother, who was the only one to survive. And in the back, I discovered in the back, I don't think it's ever been discovered before, I discovered in the back of the Grotte des Fées, where they had where these guys had sheltered, are the words Trotsky, 1913. He'd been there too. No one ever knew that before. So Pierre Nora had a particular personal interest in this for obvious reasons, but he was kind enough to say this is, in my view, the most comprehensive book about the Vercors that has so far been written. I'm sure there are mistakes in it. You can't write a book of this scale without making lots and lots of mistakes. But that's a very generous thing to say, and very generous thing to say. And, you know, by the way, I pay tribute to this man. I cannot get over the generosity of the people who've helped me in this book. He is certainly one. Jean-Louis Cremieux de Briac, who's an astonishing, was indeed a young man with de Gaulle and a historian of great note in my view. He's also been very generous in helping me, and Louis and Gilles Vergniaud at Grenoble and Lyon University, who's arguably the greatest authority on actually what went on in the Vercors, has also given me extremely generous assistance. I mean, I was an ingenue wandering into this dangerous territory, I have to say to you, and I'm tremendously grateful to people who've mapped little paths through otherwise forests that I've got lost in for me to follow. Anything else, the guys?
I'm slightly conscious of time, so maybe there's one more question for you.
Okay. None? Thank you all very much. I'm sorry I can't stay longer in your conference, and it's a privilege to be here, and thank you very much for coming.
Yes, thank you very much. Fascinating.